One of the ironies of being in a failed transition to democracy is that you get to be former member of so many councils very quickly. So I am a former member of the Egyptian parliament. The irony is I served in parliament only for 6 months. I am a former member of the National Council on Human Rights in Egypt, and I served in the council for less than a year. So one of the ironies, personal ironies, which you get to go through is that you get to be former member of so many councils in a country where democratic transitions do not work out. Let me welcome you all to a different topic, where the discussion is, in fact, centered around countries where we could not talk for a very long time. And this is what you get. In order for citizens to be able to talk, for governments to listen to citizens, you need to have less fear, you need to have stable institutions, you need to have ruling elites which rule based on a democratic mandate. And that all we did not have in the region. In the Arab world, as the democratic uprisings were emerging in 2010 and 2011. In Tunisia, 2010, in Egypt, 2011, followed by different uprisings which took their countries in too many different directions in Libya, Yemen, Syria, Bahrain, across North Africa and the Middle East throughout the last years. This is a scene from Tahrir Square in 2011, during the 18 days of the Egyptian democratic uprising, and the lady has a poster which is very indicative of what Egyptians were looking for in 2011. They were trying to get their government to listen. And it states, it's not people who should fear their government, governments should fear their people, because if you do not have democratic credentials, if you do not have popular acceptance, what you end up with is a relationship of fear, where governments put forward repression, put forward repressive measures, and people try to resist sometimes, do not resist many times, but when they resist, they take to the streets. They do not go to elections, they do not go to polling centers, they take to streets, because this is the only way to get their governments to listen. In Morocco, a different country in North Africa and the Middle East, where a monarchical family has been ruling since the 1950s, using religion as a source of legitimacy as well, people took to the streets in spite of having some institutions on the ground, having had elections for so many decades. However, people took to the streets in 2011, 2012, demanding a new Morocco. The different posters which you can see say in Arabic that they demand a new Morocco, a Morocco where they were looking for a different social contract. And here you have to factor in not only that governments in the region democratically failed to build and put on the ground institutions which can serve people, but they failed to deliver even basic needs. We have high poverty rates in most of these countries. In Egypt, according to official sources, around 30%. In Morocco, around 30%. Apart from the Gulf region, which has been living on oil revenues, natural gas revenues for so many decades, everyone else across this vast region has been suffering from poverty, high unemployment rates, and very high corruption rates, endemic corruption rates. And here is once again, when you cannot talk, when you don't have institutions which can facilitate a negotiation of any sort between constituencies, between citizens and governments get back at citizens who take to the street to demand very legitimate improvements in their living conditions, in their ability to state what they are looking for, what kind of country, what kind of government, what kind of state-society relations they are looking for. Governments get back at peaceful demonstrators, at peaceful protesters using violence. And here you see different scenes from 2011, 2012, and 2013 as they were playing out across this vast region: Syria, Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and elsewhere. However, for some time after the democratic uprisings in 2010 and 2011, citizens were keen on playing it in a non-violent manner. We did not see a great eruption of violence in 2011, 2012, unlike what we unfortunately have come to see in the last 3 years. Right now, when you look at the region or when you watch the news, The only news items which come across from the Arab world, from the Middle East and North Africa, are violence-related. It's ISIS, it's terrorist groups in Sinai, in Egypt, different terrorist groups in Libya, different violent attempts in the Gulf, terrorist attacks, a civil war in Yemen and elsewhere. For some time, however, after the democratic uprisings, stable majorities seem to believe that Arabs can finally change their fate, that they can finally put on the ground institutions, not exactly Western institutions, but democratically legitimated institutions. They were keen on going to polling centers and vote. The scenes right here are from different Arab countries. Here is Tunisia. Before that was Egypt, where citizens were keen on voting in 2011, 2012. Voter turnout traditionally in our part of the world has been around 20% or even less. The only exception was in 2011, 2012, maybe up until today in Tunisia, where we still have a democratic process going, not upset as it has come to be in Egypt or elsewhere. But voter turnout sparked to 50% and 50% plus in 2011, 2012. And it seemed that people were finally trying to influence the fate of their countries and their societies. And it coincided with a high penetration rate of social media. In 2011, 2012, we were waking up to realize that young Arabs, and these are very young societies, we have stable majorities in most countries of this region, where we have stable majorities between 18 and 35, over 50% in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Algeria, in Egypt, and in the Gulf and in the Levant. These are young societies, and we were waking up to realize that most of these young citizens are using social media to generate their information, to put forward their opinions and ideas, and they were keen on participating. However, their participation in most cases did not take them anywhere. Governments were still very much keen on upsetting the democratic uprising. They were keen on bringing back the situation of pre-2011, pre-2010 and 2011 years. They were keen on not letting go of their power, which is not checked. They were keen of keeping their presidential and monarchical prerogatives unchecked, unmonitored. No transparency, no accountability. And the result, that it started to backfire. Backfire with a dramatic process of collapsing institutions, leading to dramatic scenes, impacting personal lives, impacting the fate of citizens and not only of institutions. Here we see scenes from the phenomenon which has unfortunately led to the death of so many Arabs in the last 2 years, from Syria, from Libya, from Egypt, and from elsewhere. Boats trying to cross the Mediterranean from the Middle Eastern side to Europe. The result is thousands and thousands of dead people and a huge problem of refugees. Here we see a refugee camp, not in Greece, not in Hungary, not anywhere in Europe, but in fact in the Middle East, in Jordan. Syrian refugees in a camp in Jordan. These two countries share borders because of the civil war and the violence of the Assad regime and the violence of his opponents as well. With the current level of destruction, we are having over 1/3 of the Syrian population, millions, are on the run. Refugees in Lebanon, in Jordan, elsewhere in the region, or trying to cross the Mediterranean to reach different European destinations. You may remember the scenes which we saw last summer of different Syrian refugees trying to cross the Mediterranean. And here is the destruction of one of the most historic sites in the Middle East, of city of Aleppo. Currently, the destruction is continued by Russian jets, by weapons of militias of the current Syrian regime, and the ongoing fight between them and violent groups on the other side. We were starting to pay a heavy price for our failure to push back against governments that are repressive and do not wish to be held accountable, in the form of seeing military tanks once again rolling in streets to take control. Egypt in 2013, a brief summer, a brief spring of democracy, a brief attempt to democratize, upset, tanks on the streets, a military coup takes place in July 2013, and the whole process is cancelled. Protest scenes, once again, at a very high price. It's not even where it was prior to 2010 and 2011. Taking to the streets right now because these repressive governments seem to have learned exactly the false lesson. Instead of opening up, instead of democratizing, instead of enabling citizens to reflect and to express their opinions freely, they are getting back to them in a more harsh manner. Taking to the streets in Egypt means, in most cases, imprisonment. Expressing views, here is a rickshaw driver in Egypt, in Cairo, expressing his views. It got to be televised. Millions of Egyptians followed it, watched it. This poor driver is not to be found. Not because he was kidnapped by the police, but he disappeared, fearing that this might happen to him. In Saudi Arabia, a country which has always been resistant to any transition and any reform, despite the talk which we keep hearing about a modernizing ruling establishment. Here is a young Saudi blogger by the name of Raif Badawi, who expressed on his Facebook page some slight opposition to the religious establishment and the way it undermines personal freedoms and personal liberties. His fate is conviction to 1,000 lashes. He is being publicly flogged. He got 50, and the 950 lashes are scheduled to happen in the next 10 years. And he is imprisoned for 10 years as well. It started to backfire, exactly taking us to pre-2010 and 2011 scenes when it comes to elections. The voter turnout, which went up to 50%, is back down to anywhere between 20% in cities. Here is a scene from Morocco, where parliamentary elections were organized a few weeks ago. Overall voter turnout around 40%, in cities 20%. In Jordan, where parliamentary elections were organized a few weeks ago, overall turnout is around 37%. In cities, especially in the capital city, Amman, around 20%. It's not voter apathy. It's definitely not voter apathy. It's people once again realizing that going to polling centers will not do it, that voting will not change these repressive governments or will not change their behavior. What we see at the end of the day in the region is a young population demanding change, trying to push forward change peacefully, facing violent repressive governments, seeing social fabrics changing into violence and counter-violence, especially in a place like Syria or Iraq, not giving up, but once again withdrawing, retreating from the public space and trying to figure out different ways of changing their own personal reality. So what we have right now is, in fact, a no-talk between the repressive governments, which try to control, to suffocate freedom and liberties, and populations, young populations, which are retreating from the public space, not in fear only, but actually, and not in apathy, but trying to shape the reality somewhere else. And therefore, the greatest energy and dynamism in the region as of now is happening away from politics, is happening away from election scenes, is happening away from the public space. It's happening in arts, it's happening in literary production. Of course, even there, young novelists face repression. At least one novelist in Egypt was imprisoned recently because of, according to the authorities, putting forward a novel in which he defamed religious authorities, very similar to the Saudi blogger Raif Badawi. But still, the energy we have in our societies is no longer in politics, is no longer in building institutions, because governments have managed to repress the energy of 2011, 2010. It's going to arts, to literature, to intellectual production, and I believe it's bound to once again take to the fore. It's bound to once again impact the public space, maybe after a brief period where our citizens are trying to make sense of what has been happening to them in the last years. Thank you very much.